At 3:47 a.m., 12 armed officers smashed through the front door of 1247 Maple Street. They expected to find a drug dealer. Instead, they found federal prosecutor David Richardson in his pajamas holding his daughter's teddy bear. What happened next would destroy careers, end a corrupt unit, and prove that sometimes the wrong address leads to the right justice. The sound that woke David Richardson wasn't his alarm clock or his 6-year-old daughter Maya's occasional nightmare. It was the splintering of solid oak, the crash of his front door exploding inward like a bomb had detonated in his foyer. Police, search warrant, get on the ground. 12 voices screamed in unison as tactical boots thundered across his hardwood floors. David's eyes snapped open in his master bedroom, his prosecutor's mind immediately calculating. Wrong address, mistaken identity, or something far worse. He'd seen enough cases to know that when police came at 3:47 a.m., someone's life was about to change forever. His first instinct wasn't to grab his federal badge from the nightstand. It wasn't to shout his credentials or demand explanations. David Richardson, the man who'd spent 15 years prosecuting federal crimes, thought only of the small voice calling from down the hallway. "Daddy, what's happening, Daddy?" Maya's bedroom door was ajar, and through it came the frightened whimper of a child whose safe world had just exploded into chaos. David slipped out of bed, his bare feet silent on the cold floor, and moved toward that voice like a shield, forming around his daughter's fear. By the time he reached Maya's doorway, she was sitting up in her princess bed, clutching her white teddy bear, Mr. Snowball, against her chest. Her dark eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down her cheeks as the sound of breaking glass and shouting voices filled their home. "It's okay, baby," David whispered, kneeling beside her bed. He took Mr. Snowball from her trembling hands and held the bear against his own chest, a father's promise that he would be the barrier between his daughter and whatever chaos had invaded their sanctuary. "Daddy's here. Everything's going to be okay." The tactical lights were sweeping down the hallway now, harsh white beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights hunting for prey. David stood slowly, positioning himself in the doorway with his back to Maya's room, creating a human wall between his daughter and the approaching storm. Sergeant Miguel Torres reached the hallway first, his AR-15 raised and ready, his 20-pound tactical vest making him look like a walking arsenal. Behind him came Detective Ray Martinez, Officer Kevin Walsh, and 9 other members of Unit 47, the department's most aggressive narcotics enforcement team. They moved with the practiced efficiency of soldiers in a war zone, except this wasn't Afghanistan. This was Maple Street, in a neighborhood where children rode bicycles and families planted flower gardens. Torres saw the black man standing in the hallway holding a child's toy, and his training kicked in, not police academy training, but the darker education he'd received in 15 years of assuming guilt before innocence, threat before humanity. "You! Get on the ground, now!" David didn't move. He stood perfectly still. Mr. Snowball pressed against his chest, his eyes meeting Torres's with a calm that seemed to confuse the sergeant. There was no resistance in David's posture, no aggression, no attempt to run or fight, just a man in pajamas holding a teddy bear, protecting a doorway. "I said get down," Torres screamed, his voice echoing off the walls of what had been, until 3 minutes ago, a peaceful family home. "My daughter is scared," David said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Can you lower your weapons? There's a child here." The simple reasonableness of the request seemed to catch Torres off guard. He'd been prepared for drugs, money, guns, violence, anything except a calm father asking for consideration of his frightened daughter. For a split second, uncertainty flickered across the sergeant's face. But Martinez stepped forward, his own weapon trained on David's chest. "Shut up and get down, or we'll put you down." David looked at Martinez, really looked at him, and something in that gaze made the detective shift uncomfortably. It wasn't fear or anger. It was the look of a man taking mental notes, cataloging faces, recording badge numbers, the look of someone who understood systems and knew exactly how they were supposed to work. "My name is David Richardson," he said, speaking to the entire tactical team, but keeping his eyes on Torres. "This is my home. My daughter is in this room behind me. I'm going to comply with your instructions, but I need you to understand that a child is present." Torres felt something strange happening, a shift in the power dynamic that he couldn't quite identify. This wasn't how suspects were supposed to behave. They were supposed to run, fight, plead, or collapse. They weren't supposed to introduce themselves like they were at a dinner party or speak with the measured calm of someone accustomed to being in control. "I don't care who you think you are," Torres snapped, but his voice carried less authority than it had moments before. "Search warrant says there's a drug operation at this address. Where are the drugs?" David's eyes moved to the search warrant in Torres's left hand, and even in the chaotic lighting, his prosecutor's training allowed him to spot the critical detail that would unravel everything. "Sergeant," David said, still holding Mr. Snowball, "what address is on that warrant?" 1274 Maple Street. Torres replied automatically, then caught himself. "Why?" "Because this is 1247 Maple Street." The words hung in the air like a detonated bomb. Torres looked down at the warrant, then at the hallway around him, then back at the calm black man, holding a teddy bear. Martinez stepped closer to read over his sergeant's shoulder, and Walsh, the youngest member of the team, felt his stomach drop as the magnitude of their mistake began to register. They had broken down the wrong door, terrorized the wrong family, aimed weapons at the wrong man. But Torres, who had spent his career learning to double down rather than admit error, wasn't ready to acknowledge the mistake. "Nice try," he said, though his voice carried less conviction. "Hands behind your back. You're under arrest." "For what crime?" David asked, the question so simple and direct that it cut through the chaos like a blade. "Resisting arrest. Interfering with police business." "I haven't resisted anything. I've answered your questions and informed you that you're at the wrong address." Torres moved forward with his handcuffs, but David raised one hand, slowly, carefully, keeping the other wrapped around Mr. Snowball. "Before you do that, Sergeant Torres," David said, reading the name tape on the man's vest, "I need you to know who you're arresting." Something in David's tone made every officer in the hallway pause. It wasn't threatening or dramatic. It was the tone of a man who was about to provide information that would change everything. "I am David Richardson, Federal Prosecutor for the Eastern District. I have been investigating Unit 47 of this police department for police corruption, civil rights violations, and conspiracy for the past 18 months. The case files documenting your unit's activities are in my home office, 30 feet from where you're standing." The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was Maya's quiet sobbing from behind her father. Torres felt the color drain from his face. Martinez lowered his weapon slightly, confusion replacing aggression. Walsh, who had been having doubts about Unit 47's methods for months, felt his worst fears crystallizing into reality. "You're lying," Torres said, but the words came out as a whisper. David looked at each officer, memorizing faces, cataloging the moment when a corrupt unit accidentally raided the home of the federal prosecutor, building cases against them. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd been wondering how to gather more evidence of their misconduct. Now they delivered themselves to his doorstep. "My federal badge and identification are on the kitchen counter," David said. "My case files are on my desk in the home office. You've just committed multiple federal crimes in front of a federal prosecutor in his own home while his daughter watches." Torres's hand trembled as he reached for his radio. He needed to call this in. But how do you explain to your captain that you've just raided the wrong house and terrorized a federal prosecutor who's been investigating your unit? How do you report that you've handed him enough evidence for additional federal charges? But before Torres could speak into his radio, David made a request that would haunt the sergeant for years to come. "Before you make that call," David said, still holding Mr. Snowball against his chest, "I need to ask you something. If this had been the right address, if I had been the suspect you were looking for, would you have shown this much concern for my daughter? Would you have cared that there was a scared child watching police officers point weapons at her father?" The question cut deeper than any federal charge could. It forced Torres to confront not just his mistake, but the assumptions that had led to it. Would he have been more careful if the suspect had been white? Would he have considered the children first? Would he have listened when a white father asked for his weapons to be lowered? Torres couldn't answer, because they both knew the truth. Martinez stepped backward, suddenly understanding that this wasn't just a wrong address raid. This was evidence. Everything they'd done in the last 5 minutes, every command, every threat, every assumption was being cataloged by a man whose job was prosecuting federal crimes. Walsh pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly, not to send messages, but to document everything he could remember. He'd joined the force to help people, not to terrorize families in their homes. Watching David Richardson stand in his own hallway, protecting his daughter while politely explaining their federal crimes, had shown Walsh exactly what kind of officer he never wanted to become. David looked down at Mr. Snowball, then back at his daughter's room, where Maya was still crying softly. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have 60 seconds to decide whether you're going to compound this situation or begin damage control. In 61 seconds, I'm going to call the FBI director. What happens between now and then will determine whether this becomes a departmental embarrassment or a federal case study in civil rights violations." Torres stared at the man holding a teddy bear, the man who spoke with quiet authority, even while being held at gunpoint in his own home. For the first time in his 15-year career, Sergeant Miguel Torres understood that he'd met someone who couldn't be intimidated, threatened, or silenced. He'd met someone who understood power better than he did. And in the soft light filtering from Maya's room, holding Mr. Snowball like a shield against injustice, David Richardson began the work that would eventually dismantle an entire corrupt unit, not through violence or vengeance, but through the patient application of law and the quiet dignity of a father protecting his daughter. 2 years earlier, David Richardson had received a phone call that would change everything. It came on a Tuesday morning at 7:23 a.m., just as he was reviewing case files in his federal office downtown. The caller was Teresa Williams, a 34-year-old nurse whose son had been arrested by Unit 47 for drug possession, drugs that she swore had been planted in his backpack during a traffic stop. "Mr. Richardson," she'd said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation, "my boy is on a roll. He's never touched drugs in his life. But they're saying he had cocaine in his bag. And I know that's impossible." David had heard similar calls before. Parents convinced of their children's innocence, unwilling to accept that their perfect kids might have secrets. But something in Teresa Williams's voice made him listen longer. Something in the specificity of her account made him take notes. "The officer, Martinez, I think his name was, he made my son get out of the car and walk to the back. Then another officer, the sergeant, he searched the backpack while Marcus was 15 feet away. Marcus couldn't even see what they were doing. When they found the drugs, my son started crying, saying, 'That's not mine, that's not mine,' but they laughed at him." David had opened a new file that day. He'd labeled it Unit 47, Pattern Investigation, and placed Teresa Williams's statement inside. He hadn't known then that this file would eventually fill 3 cabinets and lead to federal grand jury proceedings. He hadn't known that the officers who laughed at Marcus Williams would someday be standing in his own hallway, having accidentally delivered themselves into his investigation. The second call came 3 weeks later. Maria Santos, whose husband had been beaten during an arrest that Unit 47 claimed was resisting arrest. The body camera footage had mysteriously malfunctioned, but a neighbor's security camera had captured audio of her husband pleading, "Please don't hit me anymore. I'm not fighting." Then came the third call, and the fourth, and by the 6th month of David's investigation, he realized he wasn't looking at isolated incidents of misconduct. He was documenting a systematic pattern of civil rights violations that stretched back nearly a decade. The case files that Torres and his unit had seen scattered across David's home office represented 18 months of meticulous federal investigation. Each folder was labeled with a case number, a victim's name, and a specific allegation. The files Torres had glimpsed in those chaotic moments contained evidence that would have made any honest cop demand immediate reform. There was the Jenkins file, A 19-year-old college student beaten unconscious during a traffic stop for matching the description of a suspect who was later discovered to be 6 inches shorter and 40 pounds heavier. Unit 47's report claimed Jenkins had attacked Officer Martinez with a blunt object. The blunt object turned out to be a textbook on constitutional law. The Morrison file documented how Unit 47 had arrested a black businessman for loitering outside his own store while he waited for a locksmith. When Morrison produced his business license and keys, Sergeant Torres had charged him with providing false information to a police officer, claiming the documents were fake. The charges were dropped 3 days later, but not before Morrison spent a weekend in jail and lost a major client who couldn't reach him. The Patterson file was perhaps the most damning. Unit 47 had executed a drug raid on elderly Reverend Patterson's home based on an anonymous tip. They'd found no drugs, but they destroyed his living room, terrified his wife, and killed his 15-year-old dog when it barked at the intruders. Torres's report claimed the dog had aggressively charged the officers. The dog weighed 12 pounds and was blind in both eyes. But David's investigation went deeper than individual cases. He discovered that Unit 47 operated under an unofficial quota system. Officers were expected to make a certain number of arrests each month, particularly drug arrests in minority neighborhoods. This quota wasn't written in any official policy manual. It was communicated through what Torres called performance expectations and productivity standards. David had obtained internal emails through federal subpoena that revealed the ugly truth behind Unit 47's high arrest statistics. In one email chain, Torres had written to his officers, "Remember, quantity matters in this job. Better to err on the side of caution with arrests. The DA's office will sort out the real cases from the questionable ones. Our job is to keep the numbers up." Martinez had replied, "What about the constitutional stuff they taught us in academy?" Torres's response had been chilling. "The Constitution is what defense lawyers worry about. We worry about crime statistics." These emails were now evidence in David's federal investigation. Along with witness statements, video footage, medical records, and departmental communications that painted a picture of systematic civil rights violations, David had built his case the way he built all his federal prosecutions, methodically, comprehensively, and with enough evidence to withstand any challenge. The investigation had revealed that Unit 47's misconduct wasn't random. It followed predictable patterns that suggested coordination and training. Officers routinely turned off body cameras before discovering evidence. They arrested black suspects at rates significantly higher than white suspects for identical alleged crimes. They used excessive force during arrests that could have been handled with verbal commands. Most troubling, David had discovered that Unit 47's misconduct had been reported to Internal Affairs multiple times over the years. Complaints had been filed by citizens, documented by defense attorneys, and even raised by some officers within the department. But nothing had changed. The complaints had been investigated by the same supervisors who oversaw Unit 47's operations, and somehow Torres and his officers had always been cleared of wrongdoing. David's federal investigation had uncovered why. The corruption wasn't limited to Unit 47. It extended up the chain of command, into the administrative offices, and throughout a system that had learned to protect itself rather than the citizens it was supposed to serve. 3 months before the raid on his home, David had presented his preliminary findings to a federal grand jury. The grand jury had authorized expanded investigation and additional subpoenas. David had been in the process of building conspiracy charges that would have dismantled not just Unit 47, but the entire network of officials who had enabled their misconduct. The case files in David's home office contained evidence of federal crimes, conspiracy to violate civil rights, deprivation of rights under color of law, and honest services fraud. Under federal sentencing guidelines, Torres and Martinez could face decades in prison if convicted. Other officers in Unit 47 faced similar charges, depending on their level of participation. But David's investigation had also revealed something that gave him hope. Not every officer in the department was corrupt. Young officers like Kevin Walsh had filed reports expressing concern about Unit 47's methods. Some supervisors had tried to transfer officers away from Torres's influence. A few brave cops had even cooperated with David's investigation, providing inside information about quota pressures and unofficial policies. These officers had convinced David that the problem wasn't law enforcement itself. It was specific individuals who had corrupted a system that was supposed to protect everyone equally. The solution wasn't to eliminate police departments, but to eliminate the officers who had turned their badges into weapons against the communities they'd sworn to serve. Standing in his hallway with Mr. Snowball pressed against his chest, David realized that Torres and his unit had just provided him with the final piece of evidence he needed for his federal case. By raiding the wrong address, by terrorizing his family, by pointing weapons at a federal prosecutor in his own home, they had demonstrated exactly the kind of reckless disregard for civil rights that David had been documenting for 18 months. The irony was almost poetic. Unit 47 had been so confident in their ability to operate without consequences that they'd accidentally raided the home of the one person in the federal system who had the authority and evidence to hold them accountable. But David took no satisfaction in the irony. Looking at his daughter's tear-stained face, listening to her quiet sobs, he understood that this wasn't about federal prosecutions or corruption statistics. This was about children who should feel safe in their homes, families who should trust the police to protect them, and communities that deserved law enforcement that served justice rather than ego. Torres still held his radio, unsure how to report what had just happened. Martinez stared at the case files, visible through David's office doorway, understanding that his name was probably on several of those folders. Walsh continued typing on his phone, documenting everything he could remember, preparing to distance himself from a unit that had finally gone too far. But David wasn't thinking about Torres or Martinez or even his federal investigation. He was thinking about Maya, still crying in her bedroom, and about all the other children who had watched police officers point weapons at their fathers, children who lived in neighborhoods where Unit 47 operated, children who had learned to fear the people who were supposed to protect them. "Sergeant Torres," David said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of 18 months of federal investigation. "You have two choices. You can continue this charade and add federal charges to your existing problems, or you can secure your weapons, step out of my home, and wait for federal agents to arrive and sort this out properly." Torres looked around at his unit, seeing confusion and fear in their faces. For the first time in his career, he was facing a situation where his authority meant nothing, where his badge couldn't intimidate, and where his mistakes would have consequences that extended far beyond his department. In his home office, David's case files waited like silent witnesses to years of misconduct. Each folder represented a family that Unit 47 had harmed, a life they had disrupted, a citizen whose rights they had violated. And now, in the broken doorway of 1247 Maple Street, those files had found their voice. Sergeant Miguel Torres hadn't started his police career planning to become corrupt. 15 years earlier, fresh out of the academy, he'd genuinely believed in protecting and serving. He'd grown up in a working-class Latino family, where his father worked construction and his mother cleaned office buildings. Becoming a police officer had felt like climbing into the middle class, earning respect, making a difference. But somewhere between his third year on patrol and his promotion to Sergeant Torres had learned a different lesson about police work. He'd learned that the citizens who complained the loudest had the least political power. He'd learned that arrest statistics mattered more to his supervisors than constitutional procedures. Most importantly, he'd learned that fellow officers would always protect each other, even when they were wrong. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been gradual, almost imperceptible, like a slow leak in a tire that eventually leaves you stranded on the side of the road. First, Torres had simply looked the other way when veteran officers bent the rules. Then he'd actively participated in covering up questionable arrests. Finally, he'd become the architect of a system that turned civil rights violations into departmental policy. By the time Torres was promoted to lead Unit 47, he'd perfected what he called proactive policing. This meant stopping, searching, and arresting people before they committed crimes, or more accurately, stopping, searching, and arresting people who looked like they might commit crimes. In Torres's worldview, this meant young black men, regardless of what they were actually doing. Detective Ray Martinez had been Torres's most eager student. At 32, Martinez was a gym enthusiast who joined the force after washing out of military training. He'd been rejected from Marine boot camp for anger management issues, but somehow the police department had overlooked this red flag during his hiring process. Martinez had found his calling in Unit 47's aggressive tactics. He was the officer who enjoyed the physical aspects of arrest, the takedowns, the handcuffing, the sense of power that came from forcing compliance. Martinez had perfected what he called pain compliance techniques, which were really just excuses to hurt people who couldn't fight back. In the locker room, Martinez often bragged about his arrest record. "I can find probable cause to arrest anybody," he'd tell younger officers. "You just have to know what to look for." What he really meant was that he'd learned to plant evidence, manufacture witnesses, and write reports that justified whatever he wanted to do. Martinez's personnel file contained 17 citizen complaints over his 8-year career. None had resulted in discipline. Internal Affairs had consistently found that Martinez's actions were within policy or that civilian complaints were unfounded. What the file didn't show was that Martinez had learned to turn off his body camera before the most egregious violations occurred, or that witnesses to his misconduct were often threatened with arrest if they came forward. The third key member of Unit 47 was Officer Kevin Walsh. But Walsh was different from his colleagues. At 26, he was the youngest member of the unit and the most conflicted about their methods. Walsh had joined the police force because his father had been a respected cop in a neighboring district, a man who'd earned community trust through fairness and integrity. Walsh's father, retired Sergeant Patrick Walsh, had served 25 years without a single sustained complaint against him. He'd taught his son that police work was about protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. But Kevin Walsh had been assigned to Unit 47 straight out of field training, and he'd quickly learned that his father's version of policing wasn't valued in Torres's world. For the past 2 years, Walsh had watched Torres and Martinez escalate their tactics. He'd seen them plant drugs during searches, lie in police reports, and use excessive force against suspects who posed no threat. Walsh had tried to report these incidents through proper channels, but he'd been told that rookie officers needed to learn when to keep their mouths shut. The breaking point for Walsh had come 6 months earlier during a traffic stop that turned violent. Torres and Martinez had pulled over a black teenager for suspicious driving. The teenager, Deshaun Roberts, had been driving his grandmother's car to pick up her prescription medications. He'd committed no traffic violation, but Torres claimed he'd been weaving and acting nervous. When Deshaun asked why he was being stopped, Martinez had yanked him from the car and thrown him to the ground. Torres had then searched the vehicle while Martinez kept Deshaun pinned with his knee. Finding nothing, Torres had planted a small bag of cocaine under the passenger seat, then discovered it moments later. Walsh had watched this entire sequence from his patrol car, his body camera recording everything. When he'd tried to report the incident, Torres had called him into the office and explained the realities of police work. "Listen, kid," Torres had said, his voice carrying the weight of authority and threat. "Deshaun Roberts is a gang member. Maybe we didn't catch him with drugs this time, but he's dealing. We know it. The community knows it. Everybody knows it. Sometimes you have to help justice along. But we don't know he's a gang member," Walsh had protested. "He was picking up medicine for his grandmother. He was casing houses for burglary," Martinez had interjected. "The drugs we found prove his real intentions." "You planted those drugs," Walsh had said quietly. "I saw you do it." The silence that followed had been dangerous. Torres and Martinez had exchanged looks that Walsh recognized as a threat assessment. They were deciding whether he was a problem that needed to be eliminated. "Officer Walsh," Torres had said slowly, "I think you're confused about what you saw. Stress can do that to rookie officers. Maybe you should take a few days off, clear your head, and come back when you remember things correctly." Walsh had understood the message. Clearwit, conform or be destroyed. Report what you saw and face retaliation that could end your career and possibly your safety. He'd taken the 3 days off, and when he'd returned, he'd never spoken about the Deshaun Roberts case again. But Walsh had done something else. He'd made copies of his body camera footage from that day and stored them safely at home. He'd also begun documenting every questionable incident he witnessed, building his own file of Unit 47's misconduct. And when Federal Prosecutor David Richardson had quietly reached out to officers who might have concerns about Unit 47's methods, Walsh had been one of the first to respond. The dynamic between Torres, Martinez, and Walsh had created a toxic culture within Unit 47 that extended beyond these three officers. The unit included 12 officers total, and most had learned to follow Torres's lead without question. They understood that loyalty to the unit meant protection from consequences, while disloyalty meant isolation and retaliation. Officer Jennifer Lopez had learned this lesson when she'd questioned Unit 47's arrest statistics. Lopez had noticed that they arrested black suspects at a rate 5 times higher than white suspects, even in neighborhoods with similar demographics. When she'd raised this concern in a unit meeting, Torres had reassigned her to midnight shifts in the department's most dangerous district. The message was clear: ask questions and face punishment. Detective Michael Chen had made the mistake of writing honest police reports that didn't support Torres's preferred narratives. Chen's reports were factual, detailed, and legally sound, but they didn't always provide the probable cause that Torres wanted for searches and arrests. After Chen's third insufficient report, Torres had him transferred out of Unit 47 entirely. Chen was told that he lacked the aggressive mindset necessary for narcotics enforcement. The officers who remained in Unit 47 had learned to adapt. They wrote reports that justified whatever actions Torres and Martinez took. They backed up questionable witness statements. They testified in court that excessive force had been necessary for officer safety. Most importantly, they stayed silent about misconduct they witnessed. This code of silence was enforced through both formal and informal mechanisms. Formally, Torres evaluated all officers in Unit 47, and negative evaluations could end careers. Informally, officers who didn't conform faced social isolation, denial of backup during dangerous calls, and sometimes direct intimidation. But the corruption went deeper than individual officers protecting each other. Unit 47 operated under a set of unofficial policies that contradicted everything taught in police academy training. These policies were never written down, but they were communicated clearly to every officer in the unit. The first unofficial policy was arrest first, find evidence later. This meant that if Torres or Martinez decided someone was guilty, officers were expected to find or create evidence to support charges. If drugs weren't found during a search, they could be planted. If witnesses didn't exist, they could be manufactured. If suspects didn't resist arrest, reports could claim they had. The second unofficial policy was protect the unit above all else. This meant that Unit 47's reputation was more important than individual rights, constitutional protections, or even departmental regulations. Officers were expected to lie for each other, cover up each other's mistakes, and present a united front against any external investigation. The third unofficial policy was keep the numbers up. Unit 47's high arrest statistics had made Torres a star within the department. His superiors praised his productivity and used his unit as a model for other narcotics teams. This success had given Torres political protection that he used to shield his officers from accountability. Standing in David Richardson's hallway, with tactical lights illuminating case files that documented their crimes, Unit 47 finally faced a situation that their unofficial policies couldn't handle. They couldn't arrest their way out of raiding a federal prosecutor's home. They couldn't plant evidence to justify terrorizing a 6-year-old girl. They couldn't manufacture witnesses to support their claim that they'd followed proper procedures. For the first time in his career, Torres found himself in a situation where the truth mattered more than his authority. The man holding the teddy bear wasn't intimidated by his badge, impressed by his tactical gear, or frightened by his reputation. David Richardson understood power better than Torres did, because Richardson's power came from law rather than force. Martinez felt his confidence evaporating as he stared at the case files visible through the office doorway. His name was probably in those folders, along with details of arrests he'd made, reports he'd filed, and lies he'd told. For the first time since joining Unit 47, Martinez understood that actions had consequences and that badges didn't provide immunity from justice. Walsh continued typing on his phone, but his motivation had shifted. Instead of documenting evidence to protect himself, he was recording everything he could remember to help federal investigators. This was his chance to finally do what his father had taught him, to protect the vulnerable and serve justice rather than ego. The other officers in Unit 47 stood in David's hallway, slowly realizing that their careers were over. They'd followed Torres and Martinez into situations they'd known were wrong, and now they faced federal prosecution for their silence. Some, like Lopez, felt relief that the truth was finally emerging. Others, like the veterans who'd taught Torres his methods, felt only anger that they'd finally been caught. But in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their misconduct, even the most corrupt officers in Unit 47 understood something important. The system that had protected them for years was broken. The code of silence that had shielded them from accountability was meaningless. And the federal prosecutor standing in his pajamas, holding his daughter's teddy bear, represented a different kind of law enforcement, one that actually served justice. Torres looked around at his unit, seeing fear and uncertainty in their faces. For 15 years, he'd taught them that power came from intimidation and authority came from violence. But standing in the home of a man who understood real power, Torres finally realized how weak he'd always been. "Sergeant Torres," David said again, his voice steady despite everything that had happened. "You have 30 seconds to decide whether this situation gets worse or whether you start making it better." Torres reached for his radio, knowing that whatever he said next would determine whether Unit 47 went down in history as a cautionary tale about police corruption or as evidence that the system could still hold bad cops accountable. The choice was his, but the consequences would belong to everyone whose life Unit 47 had damaged over the years. Torres stared at his radio for what felt like an eternity, but was actually only 15 seconds. His thumb hovered over the transmission button as his mind raced through possible explanations for what had just happened. How do you tell your captain that you've raided the wrong house? How do you explain that you've terrorized a federal prosecutor who's been investigating your unit? How do you admit that your career is over and your freedom is in jeopardy? But before Torres could key his radio, David Richardson made a simple request that changed everything. "Sergeant Torres, before you make that call, I'd like to make one of my own." David's voice was calm, reasonable, almost conversational. He wasn't shouting demands or making threats. He was simply informing Torres that he intended to exercise his constitutional right to make a phone call. But something in David's tone made every officer in the hallway understand that this wasn't going to be a call to a lawyer or a family member. "You don't get to make any calls until we sort this out," Martinez said, his voice carrying less authority than usual. He was trying to maintain control of a situation that had already spiraled beyond anyone's control. David looked at Martinez with the patient expression of a prosecutor who dealt with difficult witnesses. "Detective Martinez, I am a federal prosecutor, standing in my own home, holding my daughter's teddy bear, after you and your unit broke down my door without legal justification. I am going to make a phone call. The only question is whether you're going to add obstruction of justice and interference with federal law enforcement to the charges you're already facing." The matter-of-fact way David delivered this information was more intimidating than any shouting could have been. He wasn't emotional or angry. He was simply explaining the legal reality of their situation. Torres realized that David Richardson was treating this like a federal case because it was a federal case. Walsh stopped typing on his phone and looked up at David. "Sir, who are you planning to call?" David looked at Walsh, recognizing something different in the young officer's demeanor. Unlike Torres and Martinez, Walsh seemed genuinely concerned about the situation rather than angry about being caught. "I'm going to call FBI Director Patricia Hayes," David said simply. "She needs to know that Unit 47 has just committed multiple federal crimes during an illegal raid on a federal prosecutor's home." The silence that followed was so complete that Maya's quiet sobbing from her bedroom seemed to echo through the hallway. The implications of David's statement hit each officer differently, but they all understood that their situation had just escalated beyond anything their department could handle. Torres felt his stomach drop. FBI Director Patricia Hayes wasn't just any federal official. She was the head of the nation's premier law enforcement agency. A phone call from a federal prosecutor to the FBI director about civil rights violations would trigger an immediate federal investigation that could destroy entire careers and send people to prison for decades. Martinez's face had gone pale. He'd spent his career believing that his badge protected him from consequences. But federal charges were different from departmental discipline. The FBI didn't care about local police politics or unofficial policies. They investigated crimes and prosecuted criminals, regardless of whether those criminals wore badges. Walsh felt a mixture of fear and relief. Fear because he was standing in the hallway with Torres and Martinez when they'd committed federal crimes. Relief because the truth was finally going to come out, and the system that had protected corrupt cops for years was about to be held accountable. "You can't call the FBI director at 4 a.m, Torres said, grasping for any argument that might delay the inevitable. David pulled his phone from his pajama pocket and held it up so Torres could see the screen. "Patricia Hayes gave me her personal number 2 years ago when I started investigating police corruption in this district. She told me to call her immediately if I ever encountered interference with my federal investigation." David's thumb moved to his contacts list, and Torres could see FBI Director Hayes' personal listed among the numbers. The reality of David's federal authority was becoming undeniable. This wasn't a local prosecutor who could be intimidated or silenced. This was a federal prosecutor with direct access to the highest levels of law enforcement. "Now, Sergeant Torres," David continued, his voice remaining steady despite everything that had happened, "you can continue pointing weapons at me while I make this call, which will add additional federal charges, or you can secure your weapons and step away from my family while federal agents sort this out properly." Torres looked around at his unit, seeing confusion and fear in their faces. For the first time in his 15-year career, he was facing a situation where his authority meant nothing and his badge provided no protection. The man standing in front of him, holding a teddy bear and wearing pajamas, had more real power than Torres had ever possessed. Martinez stepped forward, his hand still on his weapon. "We're not going anywhere until we verify your identity and sort out this situation." David looked at Martinez with the expression of a prosecutor who'd just heard a defendant dig their own grave. "Detective Martinez, you are standing in the home of a federal prosecutor, pointing a weapon at him and his family after executing an illegal search warrant on the wrong address. Every additional moment you remain here adds to your federal charges. But please continue talking." The simple directness of David's response cut through Martinez's bravado like a knife. Martinez realized that everything he said was being used against him by a man whose job was prosecuting federal crimes. For the first time in his career, Martinez understood that he was the criminal in this situation. David pressed the call button on his phone. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet hallway as the phone began to ring. Torres felt his last chance to control the situation slipping away with each ring. On the second ring, a voice answered. Even through the phone's speaker, FBI Director Patricia Hayes' voice carried unmistakable authority. "David, what's wrong?" The fact that the FBI director had answered her personal phone at 4:17 a.m. and immediately recognized David's voice was not lost on anyone in the hallway. This wasn't a distant professional relationship. This was a federal prosecutor with direct access to the head of the FBI. "Patricia, I'm sorry to wake you, but I need to report federal crimes in progress," David said, his voice carrying the calm professionalism of someone making an official report. "Unit 47 of the local police department has just executed an illegal search warrant on my home. They broke down my door, terrorized my 6-year-old daughter, and are currently pointing weapons at me in my own hallway." Torres felt the blood drain from his face as he listened to David's calm, factual report to the FBI director. Every word was true, every detail was accurate, and every statement was being made by a federal prosecutor whose credibility was unquestioned. "Are you and your family safe?" Director Hayes asked immediately. "We're physically unharmed, but Maya is traumatized." The officers executed a search warrant for 12744 Maple Street. "But this is 11247 Maple Street. They've been in my home for approximately 30 minutes, and I've just informed them of my identity and the federal investigation I've been conducting into their unit." The pause that followed was dangerous. Torres could almost feel Director Hayes processing the implications of what David had just told her. A federal prosecutor investigating police corruption had been raided by the same corrupt unit he was investigating. The irony would have been funny if the consequences weren't so serious. "David," Director Hayes said, her voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "put me on speaker. I want to address the officers directly." David looked at Torres and held up his phone. "Sergeant Torres, the FBI director would like to speak with you." Torres stared at the phone as if it were a bomb about to explode. Speaking to the FBI director while standing in a federal prosecutor's home, surrounded by evidence of his unit's crimes, was not a conversation he was prepared to have. "Sergeant Torres," Director Hayes' voice filled the hallway. "This is FBI Director Patricia Hayes. You and your unit are to secure your weapons immediately. Exit Mr. Richardson's home and wait outside for federal agents to arrive. Do not touch anything, do not move anything, and do not leave the scene. Federal agents are en route and will arrive within 20 minutes. Torres felt his last vestige of authority evaporate. The FBI director wasn't asking for his cooperation. She was giving him direct orders, and unlike his departmental chain of command, she had the power to enforce those orders with federal charges. "Ma'am," Torres said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we executed a valid search warrant. We followed proper procedures." The silence that followed was so ominous that even Martinez lowered his weapon slightly. When Director Hayes spoke again, her voice carried the cold precision of someone who'd built her career prosecuting criminals. "Sergeant Torres, you executed a search warrant on the wrong address. You broke down the door of a federal prosecutor's home. You terrorized his family. You pointed weapons at a federal law enforcement officer in his own house. And you did all of this while being the subject of a federal investigation for civil rights violations. There are no proper procedures that justify what you've done." Torres felt his world collapsing around him. Every word Director Hayes spoke was true, and every truth was a federal crime. His career was over, his freedom was in jeopardy, and his unit's crimes were about to be exposed at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. Walsh stepped forward, his phone still in his hand. "Director Hayes, this is Officer Kevin Walsh. I've been documenting everything that's happened here tonight, and I want you to know that I've been cooperating with Mr. Richardson's federal investigation into Unit 47's activities." Director Hayes' voice softened slightly when she addressed Walsh. "Officer Walsh, secure your weapon and move away from the other officers. Federal agents will want to interview you separately." Walsh immediately holstered his weapon and stepped toward the far end of the hallway, physically distancing himself from Torres and Martinez. His action was symbolic as much as practical. He was choosing federal law over unit loyalty. Martinez looked at Walsh with disgust. "You're a traitor to your own unit." Walsh looked back at Martinez with something approaching pity. "I'm loyal to the law, not to criminals who wear badges." The exchange between Walsh and Martinez crystallized everything that was wrong with Unit 47's culture. Martinez saw loyalty to corrupt cops as more important than loyalty to the law. Walsh understood that real police officers protected citizens from criminals, even when those criminals were other cops. "Detective Martinez," Director Hayes said, having heard the exchange, "you just called an honest police officer a traitor for refusing to participate in federal crimes. That statement will be included in your federal prosecution." Martinez realized that his own words were being used against him by the FBI director. Everything he said was being recorded, documented, and added to his federal charges. For the first time in his career, Martinez understood what suspects felt like when they realized they were trapped by their own admissions. David looked at Maya's bedroom door, where his daughter's crying had finally stopped. "Patricia, Maya has been through enough tonight. How quickly can we get these officers out of my home?" "Federal agents are 3 minutes out," Director Hayes replied. "Sergeant Torres, you and your unit are to exit the residence immediately and wait in your vehicles. Do not discuss this situation with each other. Do not contact your supervisors, and do not leave the scene. Federal agents will take control of the situation upon arrival. Torres looked around his unit one final time, seeing fear and uncertainty in every face. The confident, aggressive officers who'd broken down David's door 40 minutes earlier were gone, replaced by frightened individuals who finally understood the consequences of their actions. "Move out," Torres said quietly. "Everyone outside." As Unit 47 began filing out of David's home, each officer walked past the case files visible in his office. Each folder represented a family they'd harmed, a life they'd disrupted, a citizen whose rights they'd violated, and now those files would become evidence in their own federal prosecution. Martinez was the last to leave, and he paused at the broken doorway to look back at David. "This isn't over," he said, his voice carrying a threat that everyone recognized. David looked at Martinez with the calm confidence of a federal prosecutor who'd just watched a defendant confess to additional crimes. "Detective Martinez, you just threatened a federal prosecutor in the presence of the FBI director. You're absolutely right. This isn't over. It's just beginning." As Martinez walked out of the house, David could hear the sound of federal vehicles arriving outside. Red and blue lights flashed through his windows as FBI agents surrounded Unit 47's patrol cars. The investigation that David had been conducting for 18 months was about to become a federal case study in police corruption and civil rights violations. "David," Director Hayes said through the phone, "are you certain you and Maya are unharmed?" David looked toward his daughter's bedroom, where the sound of crying had been replaced by silence. "We'll be okay, Patricia, but Maya is going to need time to process what happened here tonight. Federal Victim Services will be in touch tomorrow to provide support for you and your family," Director Hayes assured him. "And David, I want you to know that this federal investigation just became the Justice Department's highest priority. Unit 47's actions tonight have given us everything we need to dismantle their entire operation." As David ended the call with Director Hayes, he realized that his federal investigation had just achieved something he'd never expected. Unit 47 had provided him with irrefutable evidence of their crimes by committing those crimes against him personally. They'd raided the wrong house and found exactly the right person to hold them accountable. Outside, federal agents were reading Unit 47 their rights, while crime scene technicians began documenting the damage to David's home. The broken door, the scattered case files, and the traumatized family would all become evidence in a federal prosecution that would send corrupt cops to prison and begin the process of reforming a broken system. David stood in his hallway, still holding Mr. Snowball, and realized that sometimes justice came from the most unexpected places. Unit 47 had spent years believing they were above the law, and their arrogance had finally led them to raid the home of the one person who had the authority and evidence to prove them wrong. The first person to witness the federal response to Unit 47's raid was Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, and a 78-year-old retired school principal who lived 3 houses down from David Richardson. Mrs. Patterson had been awake since 3:30 a.m., unable to sleep due to arthritis pain, when she'd heard the sound of splintering wood echoing through the quiet neighborhood. From her kitchen window, Mrs. Patterson had watched 12 armed officers storm into what she knew was the home of that nice prosecutor and his little girl. She'd met David Richardson twice at neighborhood barbecues, where he'd impressed her with his quiet dignity and the gentle way he interacted with Maya. The sight of tactical officers breaking down his door had filled her with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. Mrs. Patterson had immediately called 911, but the dispatcher had told her that police were already aware of the ongoing operation on Maple Street. When she'd asked what operation required breaking down the door of a family with a small child, the dispatcher had told her that information wasn't available to civilians. But Mrs. Patterson hadn't been a school principal for 43 years without learning how to get information when officials tried to hide it from her. She'd called her nephew Marcus, a sergeant in the neighboring county's sheriff's department, and asked him to find out what was happening on her street. Aunt Eleanor, Marcus had said when he called back 20 minutes later, "Something's not right about this. Nobody in law enforcement knows about any operation on Maple Street tonight, and the address they raided doesn't match any active warrants in the system." Mrs. Patterson had hung up the phone and done something she hadn't done in 15 years. She'd activated the neighborhood phone tree that parents had used to organize school activities when their children were young. Within 30 minutes, half the neighborhood knew that something terrible was happening at the Richardson house. By the time federal agents arrived at 4:23 a.m., 14 neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk across from David's house. They stood in bathrobes and pajamas, holding cell phones and coffee cups, watching as FBI agents placed Unit 47 officers in handcuffs and loaded them into federal vehicles. Mrs. Patterson approached the FBI agent who appeared to be in charge, a tall black woman wearing a windbreaker with FBI emblazoned across the back. The agent's name tag read Chen, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to taking control of chaotic situations. "Excuse me, Agent Chen," Mrs. Patterson said, her voice carrying the tone she'd once used to address school board meetings. "I'm Eleanor Patterson. I live on this street, and I need to know, is the Richardson family safe?" Agent Sarah Chen looked at the elderly woman, recognizing the concern of a neighbor who genuinely cared about her community. "Ma'am, the family is physically unharmed. We're processing the scene now, and we'll have more information soon." "Those officers," Mrs. Patterson said, pointing toward the patrol cars, where Unit 47 sat in handcuffs, "they broke down that man's door in the middle of the night. There's a little girl in that house. What kind of police work requires terrorizing children?" Agent Chen's expression hardened slightly. "Ma'am, I can't discuss the details of an ongoing federal investigation, but I can tell you that what happened here tonight is exactly the kind of situation that federal oversight is designed to address." Mrs. Patterson nodded, understanding the coded language. "So they screwed up, and now the FBI is cleaning up their mess." "That's not an inaccurate assessment," Agent Chen replied carefully. As dawn began to break over Maple Street, more neighbors emerged from their homes. The sight of federal agents and crime scene tape had drawn the attention of people who normally wouldn't be awake for another 2 hours. By 5:30 a.m., nearly 40 residents had gathered to watch the federal investigation unfold. Among the crowd was James Morrison, the black businessman whose store Unit 47 had illegally arrested him outside of 2 years earlier. Morrison had moved to this neighborhood specifically because it was supposed to be safe, where police officers were professional and residents were treated with respect. Seeing federal agents arresting the same officers who had humiliated him filled Morrison with a satisfaction he'd thought he'd never feel. Morrison pulled out his phone and began recording the scene, not for social media or news outlets, but for his own peace of mind. He wanted to document the moment when corrupt cops finally faced consequences for their actions. As he filmed, Morrison spoke quietly into his phone. "This is James Morrison, and I'm watching federal agents arrest the officers from Unit 47 who destroyed my life 2 years ago. They arrested me for loitering outside my own store, cost me a major client, and made me spend a weekend in jail for a crime that never happened. Today they raided the wrong house and terrorized a federal prosecutor's family. Sometimes justice takes a while, but it eventually shows up." Near Morrison stood Maria Santos, whose husband had been beaten by Unit 47 during an arrest for resisting when he'd actually been fully cooperative. Maria had spent 2 years trying to get someone in authority to listen to her complaints about Unit 47's violence. She'd filed reports with Internal Affairs, spoken to city council members, and even contacted local news stations. Everyone had told her that her husband must have done something to deserve his treatment. Watching Unit 47 officers sitting in federal custody, Maria felt vindicated in a way she'd never expected. She called her husband, who was getting ready for his early shift at the hospital where he worked as a janitor. "Roberto," she said when he answered, "turn on the news. The police who beat you are being arrested by the FBI." Roberto Santos had lived with chronic pain from his injuries for 2 years, but he'd never filed a lawsuit or pursued criminal charges because he'd been afraid of retaliation. Watching the officers who had hurt him face federal charges, he felt something he'd almost forgotten, hope that the system could still work for people like him. But the most significant observer in the crowd was Teresa Williams, whose phone call to David Richardson 2 years earlier had started the federal investigation that led to this moment. Teresa had arrived at 6 a.m. after receiving a call from Mrs. Patterson, who remembered her from a neighborhood meeting where Teresa had spoken about her son's false arrest. Teresa stood on the sidewalk, watching federal agents document the scene where Unit 47 had finally been caught. Her son Marcus was now a sophomore in college, but he still had nightmares about the night Torres and Martinez had planted drugs in his backpack and laughed when he'd protested his innocence. Agent Chen approached Teresa, recognizing her from the witness interviews that had been conducted during David's investigation. "Mrs. Williams," Agent Chen said, "I wanted you to know that what happened here tonight is going to strengthen the federal case against Unit 47 significantly. Your son's case was instrumental in building the foundation for this investigation." Teresa looked at the federal agent, then at the officers sitting in handcuffs, then back at David's broken door. "Agent Chen, my son was 17 when they arrested him. He cried for hours that night, saying, 'Mama, they put drugs in my bag and nobody believes me.' I almost didn't believe him myself, because who wants to think that police officers would frame a child?" "Your son was telling the truth," Agent Chen said firmly. "And because you were brave enough to call federal prosecutors, other families won't have to go through what you went through." As the morning progressed, news crews began arriving on Maple Street. The first van belonged to Channel 7, followed quickly by Channel 3 and Channel 12. By 7 a.m., satellite trucks lined the street as reporters set up for live broadcasts about the federal raid on a police unit. The news coverage attracted more community members who had been affected by Unit 47's misconduct over the years. People drove from across the city to witness the moment when corrupt cops finally faced consequences. The crowd grew to over 100 people, creating a spontaneous gathering of Unit 47's victims and their families. Dr. Angela Richardson arrived at 7:30 a.m., still wearing her hospital scrubs from the night shift she'd just completed. Angela was David's wife and Maya's mother, and she'd been in surgery when the raid occurred. The sight of federal crime scene tape around her home and her neighbors gathered on the sidewalk told her everything she needed to know. Agent Chen intercepted Angela before she could reach her house. "Dr. Richardson, your husband and daughter are safe. They're inside with victim services specialists. We'll have the scene processed within the hour, so you can return to your home." Angela looked at her broken front door, then at the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to support her family. "Agent Chen, what exactly happened here?" "Your husband can provide the details, but the short version is that Unit 47 executed a search warrant on the wrong address and discovered they'd raided the home of the federal prosecutor, who's been investigating them for civil rights violations." Angela stared at the agent for a moment, processing the irony. "So they accidentally raided their own investigator." "That's essentially correct," Agent Chen confirmed. Angela looked around at the crowd of neighbors, many of whom she recognized from school events and community gatherings. She saw James Morrison, who had told her about his false arrest at a neighborhood barbecue. She saw Maria Santos, whose husband's injuries from police violence had been the subject of neighborhood gossip. She saw Teresa Williams, who had organized a community meeting about police accountability after her son's arrest. "These people," Angela said, gesturing toward the crowd, "they're not just neighbors, are they? They're victims." Agent Chen nodded. "Many of them have been affected by Unit 47's misconduct over the years. Word spread through the community that the unit was finally facing federal charges. They came to witness accountability." Inside the house, David was sitting with Maya on her bed, reading her favorite book, while victim services specialist Dr. Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Officer Kevin Walsh, observed their interaction. Maya had stopped crying, but she was clinging to both Mr. Snowball and her father with an intensity that spoke to her trauma. "Daddy," Maya said quietly, "why did the police break our door?" David looked at his daughter, searching for words that could explain systematic corruption and racial bias to a 6-year-old. "Sometimes, baby, people make mistakes, big mistakes. And when people who are supposed to protect us make mistakes, other people have to help fix those mistakes." "Are the bad police going to jail?" David held Maya closer, understanding that his answer would shape how she viewed justice for the rest of her life. "Yes, baby, the bad police are going to face consequences for what they did, not just to us, but to other families too." Through Maya's bedroom window, David could see the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to support his family. He recognized many faces, People who had smiled and waved during evening walks, who had attended Maya's birthday parties, who had brought casseroles when Angela was working long shifts at the hospital. But David also understood that this crowd represented something larger than neighborhood support. These were citizens who had been failed by their local police department and were witnessing the moment when federal law enforcement stepped in to restore accountability. They were seeing proof that corrupt cops could be held responsible for their actions. Dr. Walsh approached David carefully. "Mr. Richardson, how are you processing what happened here tonight?" David looked at the victim services specialist, then at his daughter, then at the crowd visible through the window. "I've been investigating Unit 47 for 18 months, documenting their crimes, building federal cases against them. But seeing them break down my door, point weapons at my daughter, threaten my family, that made it personal in a way that case files never could." "That's a normal response," Dr. Walsh assured him. "Even prosecutors can be traumatized when they become victims of the crimes they're investigating." David nodded, but his mind was already moving beyond his own trauma to the broader implications of what had happened. "The ironic thing is that Unit 47 just provided me with the final evidence I needed for their federal prosecution. They've given me first-hand experience of their methods, documentation of their disregard for civil rights, and proof that they'll violate anyone's constitutional protections if they think they can get away with it." Outside, the crowd continued to grow as word spread through social media and local news coverage. Maple Street Justice began trending on Twitter as people shared videos of Unit 47 officers in federal custody. The hashtag was accompanied by stories from other Unit 47 victims who finally felt safe enough to share their experiences publicly. One tweet read, "Unit 47 planted drugs on my brother in 2019. He spent 8 months in jail before charges were dropped. Today I watched them get arrested by the FBI. Sometimes justice is slow, but it's real." Another tweet shared, "They beat my father during a routine traffic stop. Internal Affairs said he resisted arrest. Today federal agents proved what we always knew. Unit 47 are criminals with badges. Maple Street Justice." As the morning progressed, the crowd on Maple Street became a celebration of accountability rather than a protest against injustice. People who had been silenced for years were finally seeing corrupt officers face consequences. Families who had been told their complaints were unfounded were watching federal agents validate their experiences. Mrs. Patterson stood at the center of the crowd, her white hair catching the morning sunlight as she spoke to a news reporter. "I've lived on this street for 47 years, she told the camera. "I've seen good police officers and bad police officers, but I've never seen police officers so arrogant that they'd raid the wrong house and terrorize a family with a little girl. What happened here tonight wasn't a mistake. It was the inevitable result of a culture that taught officers they were above the law." The reporter asked Mrs. Patterson what she thought should happen to Unit 4. "They should face the same justice they denied to everyone else," she replied firmly. "They should be held accountable under the law, just like any other criminal. And the system that protected them for so long should be reformed, so this never happens again." As federal agents finished processing the scene and prepared to allow the Richardson family to return to their home, Agent Chen addressed the crowd that had gathered. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "the FBI appreciates your patience and cooperation during this investigation. What happened here tonight represents a serious breach of civil rights that will be prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. If any of you have information about misconduct by Unit 47 or any other law enforcement officers, federal investigators will be available to take your statements." The crowd didn't disperse immediately. Instead, people lingered, sharing stories, exchanging contact information, and organizing support for the Richardson family. What had started as a gathering of concerned neighbors had evolved into a community that finally felt empowered to demand accountability from their police department. David emerged from his house at 9 a.m., carrying Maya in his arms as he surveyed the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to support his family. He saw faces he recognized and faces he didn't, but all carried the same expression, relief that corrupt cops had finally been caught. "Thank you all for being here," David said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "What happened to my family last night has happened to too many families in our community. But today we see that the system can still work when good people demand accountability. The crowd began to applaud, not for David personally, but for the moment when justice had finally arrived on Maple Street. As the applause faded, David made a promise that would define the rest of his federal prosecution of Unit 47. I will make sure that every family harmed by Unit 47 gets justice, not just in federal court, but in our community, in our police department, and in the system that failed to protect us for too long. As the crowd finally began to disperse, neighbors exchanged phone numbers and made plans to attend Unit 47's federal trial. The community that had been fractured by police misconduct was beginning to heal through shared accountability and mutual support. The federal investigation that had started with Teresa Williams's phone call 2 years earlier had finally reached its moment of truth on Maple Street, where corrupt cops had raided the wrong house and found exactly the right kind of justice waiting for them. At 6:45 a.m., FBI Director Patricia Hayes stood in the federal building's Situation Room, watching live feeds from Maple Street as her agents processed the scene of Unit 47's catastrophic raid. She'd been awake since David Richardson's call 2 hours earlier, coordinating a federal response that would make Unit 47's corruption case a national priority. Director Hayes had built her career prosecuting civil rights violations, and she understood that what had happened on Maple Street represented more than just police misconduct. It was a perfect storm of corruption, incompetence, and arrogance that had created an opportunity for comprehensive reform. Agent Chen, Director Hayes said into her secure communication device, "What's the status on the Richardson family?" Agent Sarah Chen's voice came through clearly from the scene. "Family is secure, Director. Mr. Richardson and his daughter are with Victim Services. Dr. Richardson has arrived and is being briefed. The scene is processed and we're ready to begin interviews with Unit 47 officers." And the community response? Significant, Director. Over 100 residents have gathered, many of whom appear to be previous victims of Unit 47's misconduct. Local media is covering extensively, and social media engagement is growing rapidly. Director Hayes nodded, understanding that the public attention would both complicate and strengthen their federal case. Agent Chen, I want you to know that this investigation has been designated Priority Alpha by the Justice Department. You have unlimited resources and full federal support. The Priority Alpha designation was reserved for cases of national significance, corruption cases that required immediate federal intervention to restore public trust in law enforcement. Unit 47's raid on David Richardson's home had achieved that designation within 3 hours of its occurrence. At 7 a.m., Agent Chen began her interviews with Unit 47 officers, starting with Kevin Walsh. Walsh had been separated from his colleagues and was being held in a federal facility downtown, away from the toxic influence of Torres and Martinez. Officer Walsh, Agent Chen began, you've indicated that you've been cooperating with Federal Prosecutor Richardson's investigation. I need you to understand that what happened this morning has fundamentally changed your situation. Walsh looked at the FBI agent, understanding that his cooperation with David's investigation might be the only thing that saved his career and kept him out of federal prison. Agent Chen, I've been documenting Unit 47's misconduct for months. I have body camera footage, written reports, and recordings of conversations where Torres and Martinez discussed planting evidence. Agent Chen leaned forward, recognizing that Walsh's evidence could be crucial to dismantling Unit 47's entire operation. Officer Walsh, are you prepared to testify against your former colleagues in federal court? Yes, Walsh replied without hesitation. What I saw them do to families in our community, what I saw them do to the Richardson family this morning, that's not police work. That's terrorism with badges. Walsh's use of the word terrorism was significant. Federal prosecutors had been exploring whether Unit 47's systematic violations of civil rights constituted domestic terrorism under federal statutes. Walsh's testimony as an inside witness could provide the evidence needed to pursue those charges. Officer Walsh, Agent Chen continued, I need you to understand that your cooperation will likely result in threats from other officers, isolation within your department, and significant personal risk. Are you prepared for those consequences? Walsh thought about his father, the respected police officer who had taught him that wearing a badge meant protecting the vulnerable, not exploiting them. Agent Chen, my father served 25 years without a single sustained complaint. He taught me that good cops protect people from criminals, even when those criminals wear badges. I'm prepared to honor that legacy. While Agent Chen interviewed Walsh, other federal agents were conducting simultaneous interviews with Torres and Martinez. These interviews were being conducted by seasoned federal prosecutors who specialized in corruption cases. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres, no relation to Sergeant Torres, was handling the interview with Unit 47's leader. U.S. Attorney Torres had built his career prosecuting corrupt officials, and he understood that Sergeant Torres represented the kind of systemic corruption that federal law enforcement was designed to address. Sergeant Torres, Attorney Torres began. You executed a search warrant on 1247 Maple Street. The warrant was for 1274 Maple Street. How do you explain this discrepancy? Sergeant Torres looked at his lawyer, a public defender, who understood that his client was facing decades in federal prison. We followed standard procedures. Someone made an administrative error with the address. Sergeant Torres, administrative errors don't break down doors. Administrative errors don't terrorize families. Administrative errors don't point weapons at federal prosecutors. What happened this morning was either gross negligence or deliberate misconduct. Which was it? Torres realized that neither answer would help his situation. Gross negligence could result in federal civil rights charges. Deliberate misconduct could result in conspiracy charges that carried life sentences. I want to invoke my right to remain silent, Torres said finally. Attorney Torres nodded, understanding that Torres's silence would make the federal case easier to prosecute. Sergeant Torres, you have that right. But you should understand that Federal Prosecutor Richardson has been building a case against your unit for 18 months. What happened this morning wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a pattern of misconduct that's been documented, witnessed, and recorded. In another interview room, Detective Martinez was facing similar questions from Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Officer Walsh. Martinez's interview was complicated by his history of violence and the threats he'd made against David Richardson after the raid. Detective Martinez, Attorney Walsh began, after learning that you had raided a federal prosecutor's home. You told him, this isn't over. That statement was made in the presence of FBI Director Hayes during a recorded phone conversation. How do you explain that threat? Martinez's lawyer, a private attorney whose fees were being paid by the police union, tried to minimize his client's statement. My client was upset by the situation and spoke without thinking clearly. Attorney Walsh pressed forward. Detective Martinez has a history of making threats against citizens who challenge his authority. This wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a pattern of behavior that demonstrates his disregard for federal law enforcement. Martinez felt his situation deteriorating with each question. His threats against David Richardson were being treated as federal crimes. His history of violence was being used to establish a pattern of misconduct, and his lawyer seemed unable to provide any effective defense. While Unit 47 officers were being interviewed, federal agents were executing search warrants on their homes, vehicles, and personal communications. These searches were yielding evidence that would strengthen the federal case significantly. At Torres's home, agents found a hidden safe containing $47,000 in cash that couldn't be explained by his police salary. They also found communications between Torres and drug dealers that suggested he'd been taking payments to provide information about pending raids. At Martinez's home, agents found a collection of weapons that included items reported stolen during Unit 47's raids. They also found photographs of suspects who had been beaten during arrests, photos that Martinez had apparently kept as trophies of his violence. These discoveries transformed the federal case from civil rights violations to racketeering charges. Unit 47 hadn't just been violating citizens' constitutional rights, they'd been operating as a criminal organization that used police powers to commit crimes for personal profit. FBI Director Hayes reviewed the evidence from the searches at 10 a.m., 3 hours after the initial raid on David's home. The scope of Unit 47's criminal activity was larger than anyone had anticipated. Agent Chen, Director Hayes said during a secure video conference, "What we're seeing here goes beyond police misconduct. This unit was operating as an organized crime syndicate." Agent Chen nodded from the field command post that had been set up near Maple Street. "Director, the evidence suggests that Unit 47 was involved in drug trafficking, theft, extortion, and systematic civil rights violations. We're looking at RICO charges that could result in life sentences." The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, was designed to prosecute organized crime syndicates. Applying RICO charges to a police unit would send a powerful message that corrupt cops would be treated like the criminals they were. Director Hayes made a decision that would define federal law enforcement's response to police corruption for years to come. "Agent Chen, I'm upgrading this investigation to a federal task force. We're going to dismantle not just Unit 47, but the entire network of officials who enabled their crimes." The federal task force would include FBI agents, DEA investigators, IRS criminal investigators, and prosecutors from the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. This level of federal response was typically reserved for international terrorism cases or major organized crime investigations. At 11 a.m., U.S. Attorney General Maria Rodriguez held a press conference in Washington to address the Unit 47 case. The Attorney General rarely held personal press conferences about local police misconduct, but the circumstances of Unit 47's raid on a federal prosecutor's home had made this a national priority. This morning, Attorney General Rodriguez announced, a corrupt police unit accidentally raided the home of the federal prosecutor who had been investigating their crimes for 18 months. This incident represents everything that's wrong with police departments that refuse to hold their officers accountable. The Attorney General's press conference was broadcast live on all major news networks, turning Unit 47's corruption into a national story. The irony of corrupt cops raiding their own investigator's home had captured public attention in a way that individual misconduct cases never could. The Justice Department will prosecute this case to the full extent of federal law, Rodriguez continued. We will seek the maximum sentences allowed under federal statutes. And we will use this case to demonstrate that no police officer, regardless of rank or connections, is above the law. Back on Maple Street, David Richardson was watching the Attorney General's press conference from his living room while Maya played with Mr. Snowball nearby. The broken front door had been secured with plywood, but the federal investigation was far from over. Agent Chen approached David at noon, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that Unit 47 had inadvertently provided during their raid on his home. "Mr. Richardson," Agent Chen said, "the evidence we've gathered in the past 8 hours has exceeded our expectations. Unit 47's actions this morning have given us everything we need to pursue RICO charges against the entire unit." David looked at the FBI agent, understanding that his 18-month investigation had just been validated in the most dramatic way possible. "Agent Chen, what kind of sentences are we looking at?" "For Torres and Martinez, we're looking at 20 years to life under RICO statutes. For officers who cooperated in the conspiracy, we're looking at 10 to 15 years. For officers who testify against the conspiracy, we're looking at immunity agreements and protection programs." David nodded, understanding that federal sentencing guidelines would ensure that Unit 47's crimes resulted in serious consequences. "And what about the department officials who enabled their misconduct?" "That's where your original investigation becomes crucial," Agent Chen explained. "Your documentation of the administrative cover-ups provides evidence for obstruction of justice charges against supervisors who protected Unit 47 from accountability." As the federal response continued to escalate, community leaders began organizing support for comprehensive police reform. The Unit 47 case had created an opportunity to address systematic problems that extended beyond one corrupt unit. Reverend Marcus Johnson, whose church had been providing support to Unit 47's victims for years, held a press conference at 2 p.m. to address the broader implications of the federal investigation. Unit 47's crimes didn't happen in a vacuum, Reverend Johnson announced. They were enabled by a system that valued arrest statistics over constitutional rights, that protected bad cops instead of good citizens, and that silenced victims instead of seeking justice. Reverend Johnson's press conference was attended by dozens of Unit 47's victims, including Teresa Williams, James Morrison, and Maria Santos. Their presence demonstrated that the federal investigation represented more than just one corrupt unit. It represented hope for an entire community that had been failed by local law enforcement. Today we see federal agents holding corrupt cops accountable, Reverend Johnson continued. Tomorrow we need to build a system that prevents corruption from taking root in the first place. As evening approached, federal agents were still processing evidence from Unit 47's homes and vehicles. The scope of their criminal activity was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence discovered. Torres had been taking bribes from drug dealers in exchange for advance warning about raids. Martinez had been selling drugs seized during arrests instead of booking them as evidence. The entire unit had been operating a protection racket where businesses paid money to avoid being targeted for violations. Most significantly, federal investigators had discovered that Unit 47's corruption had been reported to Internal Affairs multiple times over the years. But those reports had been buried by supervisors who were either complicit in the crimes or afraid to challenge the unit's political protection. FBI Director Hayes reviewed the day's findings at 6 p.m., 12 hours after David Richardson's initial phone call had triggered the federal response. Agent Chen, Director Hayes said during their evening briefing, "In 12 hours, we've gathered enough evidence to dismantle an entire criminal organization that was operating under the cover of police authority. This case will set precedents for how federal law enforcement addresses police corruption." Agent Chen nodded, understanding that the Unit 47 case would be studied in law schools and police academies for decades to come. "Director, what's our timeline for federal indictments?" "The grand jury will hear evidence beginning Monday morning," Director Hayes replied. "We'll have federal indictments by the end of the week. And Agent Chen, I want you to personally ensure that every victim of Unit 47's crimes has the opportunity to address the court during sentencing." As darkness fell over Maple Street, David Richardson sat in his living room with Maya on his lap, reading her bedtime story, while federal agents continued their investigation outside. The broken door had been secured, but the broken trust between police and community would take longer to repair. "Daddy," Maya said, as David finished her story, "are the bad police never coming back?" David looked at his daughter, understanding that his answer would shape how she viewed justice and law enforcement for the rest of her life. "The bad police are going to prison, baby, and good police officers are going to make sure that families like ours are protected." "Will they fix our door?" "Yes, sweetheart. They'll fix our door, and they'll fix the things that made the bad police think they could break it." As Maya fell asleep in her father's arms, federal agents continued gathering evidence that would ensure Unit 47's corruption would never threaten another family. The federal response that had begun with a midnight raid on the wrong address had evolved into a comprehensive investigation that would reform an entire police department and send corrupt cops to federal prison for decades. Outside, Agent Chen was briefing the media on the day's developments, explaining how federal law enforcement would ensure that Unit 47's victims finally received the justice they deserved. "This case demonstrates that federal oversight works," Agent Chen told the gathered reporters. "When local systems fail to hold corrupt cops accountable, federal law enforcement will step in to protect citizens' constitutional rights." The federal response to Unit 47's crimes would continue for months, but the foundation had been laid in the first 12 hours after their catastrophic raid on David Richardson's home. Federal agents, prosecutors, and investigators had demonstrated that corrupt cops would face the same justice they had denied to so many others. 3 weeks after the midnight raid on Maple Street, federal prosecutors presented their case to a grand jury in the federal courthouse downtown. The same building where Unit 47 had once escorted suspects now hosted the proceedings that would determine whether corrupt officers would face decades in federal prison. David Richardson sat in the witness chair at 9 a.m. on Monday morning, facing 23 grand jurors who would decide whether Unit 47's crimes warranted federal prosecution. Unlike typical grand jury proceedings, which were routine formalities, this presentation would take 3 full days and include testimony from dozens of witnesses. Ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, David began. For the past 18 months, I have been investigating a pattern of civil rights violations, corruption, and criminal conspiracy operating under the cover of police authority. 3 weeks ago, the subjects of my investigation accidentally provided me with first-hand evidence of their crimes by raiding my home and terrorizing my family. The grand jury listened in silence as David presented evidence that Unit 47 had operated as a criminal organization for nearly a decade. Bank records showed unexplained income, surveillance footage documented planted evidence, and recorded conversations revealed conspiracy to violate citizens' constitutional rights. Grand Jury Foreman William Chen, a retired federal judge, asked the question that would define the entire case. Mr. Richardson, in your professional opinion, were these isolated incidents of misconduct or evidence of systematic criminal activity? David looked at the grand jurors, understanding that his answer would determine whether Unit 47 faced misdemeanor charges or life sentences under federal racketeering statutes. Based on the evidence, this was a criminal enterprise that used police powers to commit crimes for personal profit. Unit 47 wasn't just corrupt. They were organized criminals who happened to wear badges. On Tuesday, Teresa Williams took the witness stand to describe how Unit 47 had destroyed her son's life by planting drugs in his backpack. Her testimony was followed by James Morrison, whose business had been targeted after he'd filed complaints about Unit 47's misconduct. Maria Santos testified about her husband's beating, showing medical records that documented fractures, concussions, and permanent disabilities. Dr. Patricia Johnson, the emergency room physician who had treated Santos, testified that his injuries were consistent with systematic torture rather than resistance during arrest. But the most damaging testimony came from Officer Kevin Walsh, who had worn a wire during conversations with Torres and Martinez. In the weeks before the raid, federal agents had approached Walsh immediately after David's initial investigation had identified him as a potential cooperating witness. Detective Martinez told me that planting evidence was proactive policing, Walsh testified. He said that if we knew someone was guilty but couldn't prove it legally, we should help justice along by providing evidence. Walsh's recorded conversations included Martinez bragging about beating suspects, Torres discussing bribes from drug dealers, and both officers laughing about the stupid families who filed complaints that Internal Affairs would never investigate. The grand jury heard Torres's voice on the recordings. Internal Affairs is run by people who understand that statistics matter more than constitutional technicalities. As long as our arrest numbers stay high, nobody's going to question our methods. On Wednesday, federal prosecutors presented evidence of Unit 47's financial crimes. IRS investigators had traced unexplained deposits in Torres's and Martinez's bank accounts to drug dealers who had paid for advance warning about raids. Detective Sarah Martinez, no relation to Ray Martinez, from the Federal Financial Crimes Unit, testified that Unit 47 had stolen over $200,000 in cash and property during illegal searches over the past 5 years. Items reported as evidence had been sold, drugs had been redistributed for profit, and bribes had been accepted in exchange for protection from prosecution. The grand jury also heard testimony from Dr. Marcus Thompson, a forensic accountant who had analyzed Unit 47's arrest statistics and discovered patterns that proved racial bias in their enforcement activities. Unit 47 arrested black suspects at a rate 12 times higher than white suspects in identical circumstances, Dr. Thompson testified. This disparity cannot be explained by crime rates, demographics, or any legitimate law enforcement factor. This is evidence of systematic discrimination. After 3 days of testimony, the grand jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning their decision. Federal prosecutors had requested indictments on 47 different charges, ranging from civil rights violations to racketeering conspiracy. Grand Jury Foreman Chen announced the results at 3 p.m. on Wednesday. The grand jury finds probable cause for all requested indictments. We further recommend that these cases be prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. The federal indictments were unsealed on Thursday morning in a courtroom packed with Unit 47's victims, community leaders, and national media. Chief Judge Patricia Rodriguez presided over the proceedings, understanding that this case would set precedents for how federal law enforcement addressed police corruption. Sergeant Miguel Torres faced 17 federal charges, including conspiracy to violate civil rights, racketeering, drug trafficking, theft of government property, and obstruction of justice. Under federal sentencing guidelines, he faced a minimum of 25 years in prison and a maximum of life without parole. Detective Ray Martinez faced 19 federal charges, including the same conspiracy and racketeering charges as Torres, plus additional charges for assault under color of authority and witness intimidation. His sentencing range was 28 years to life. 10 other Unit 47 officers faced varying charges depending on their level of participation in the conspiracy. Officer Rebecca Davis, who had tried to report Martinez's violence, received immunity in exchange for her testimony. Officer Jennifer Lopez received reduced charges after providing evidence of Torres's corruption. But the indictments extended beyond Unit 47 itself. Captain William Hayes, who had supervised Unit 47 and buried complaints about their misconduct, faced federal charges for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Internal Affairs, Lieutenant Michael Johnson, who had dismissed dozens of legitimate complaints against Unit 47, faced charges for depriving citizens of their constitutional rights under color of law. Police Chief Robert Sullivan, who had promoted Torres despite known problems and had protected Unit 47 from accountability, faced federal charges for conspiracy and obstruction of justice. The scope of the federal indictments sent shockwaves through the police department and city government. Over 20 officials faced federal prosecution, and dozens more were placed under investigation for their roles in enabling Unit 47's crimes. At 10 a.m. on Friday, exactly 1 week after the grand jury had begun hearing evidence, Torres and Martinez were brought into federal court for their arraignment. Both men wore orange jumpsuits and shackles, a dramatic change from the tactical gear they'd worn during their raid on David's home. Judge Rodriguez addressed Torres first. "Mr. Torres, you are charged with operating a criminal enterprise under the color of police authority." So Torres looked at his lawyer, understanding that federal prosecutors had offered no plea bargains and would seek maximum sentences under federal guidelines. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Martinez followed with the same plea, but his voice shook as he spoke. The man who had terrorized citizens for 8 years was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. Judge Rodriguez set bail at $5 million for Torres and $6 million for Martinez, amounts that neither officer could afford. They would remain in federal custody until their trial, scheduled for 6 months later. As Torres and Martinez were led away in shackles, David Richardson sat in the courtroom gallery with Maya on his lap. His daughter had insisted on attending the arraignment, wanting to see the bad police face consequences for breaking their door. "Daddy," Maya whispered, "are they going to prison now?" "Not yet, baby," David replied. "But they're going to have a trial where everyone will hear about the bad things they did, and then they'll go to prison for a very long time." Outside the courthouse, community leaders held a press conference to address the broader implications of the federal indictments. Reverend Marcus Johnson spoke first, flanked by dozens of Unit 47's victims who had finally seen their attackers charged with federal crimes. "Today we see what accountability looks like," Reverend Johnson announced. "Federal prosecutors have shown that corrupt cops will face the same justice they denied to so many others, but this is just the beginning. We need systemic reform to ensure that this kind of corruption can never take root again." Teresa Williams spoke next, her voice strong despite years of being told that her son's false arrest was just one officer's word against another. "My son was 17 when Unit 47 planted drugs in his backpack," she said. "He's now 19 and still has nightmares about that night. But today, he knows that the system can work when good people demand justice. These federal charges won't give him back his innocence, but they might protect other children from experiencing what he went through." James Morrison addressed the crowd, with the dignity of a businessman who had never given up hope for justice. They arrested me for loitering outside my own store, Morrison said. They cost me clients, damaged my reputation, and made me question whether I belonged in my own community. But I never stopped believing that truth would eventually emerge. Today's indictments prove that perseverance and federal oversight can overcome local corruption. As the press conference continued, federal prosecutors announced additional measures to ensure that Unit 47's victims received comprehensive support and compensation. The Justice Department's Civil Rights Division would oversee a victim compensation fund, and the FBI would provide ongoing protection for witnesses who had testified against the conspiracy. U.S. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, no relation to the judge, explained the federal government's long-term strategy for preventing similar corruption. The Unit 47 case demonstrates what happens when local accountability fails, he announced. Federal law enforcement will continue monitoring this police department to ensure that reform is comprehensive and permanent. We will not allow another corrupt unit to terrorize citizens in this community. The federal indictments triggered immediate changes within the police department. Interim Police Chief Jennifer Walsh, no relation to Officer Kevin Walsh, was appointed to oversee comprehensive reforms, while federal investigators continued their work. Chief Walsh announced the creation of an independent oversight board with real authority to investigate misconduct complaints. The board would include community members, civil rights lawyers, and federal monitors who could intervene when local accountability failed. She also announced new training requirements that would emphasize constitutional rights, de-escalation techniques, and community policing, rather than the aggressive enforcement tactics that Unit 47 had embodied. Every officer in this department will be retrained from the ground up, Chief Walsh announced. We will build a police force that protects all citizens equally, regardless of race, economic status, or any other factor. The police union, which had initially defended Unit 47's actions, began distancing itself from the corrupt officers as evidence of their crimes became undeniable. Union President David Martinez, no relation to Detective Ray Martinez, issued a statement condemning Unit 47's actions and supporting federal prosecution. The police union represents honest officers who serve their communities with integrity. The statement read, Unit 47's actions were not police work. They were crimes that have damaged the reputation of every honest cop in this department. We support federal prosecution and comprehensive reform. As news of the federal indictments spread across the country, other communities began demanding similar federal oversight of their police departments. The Unit 47 case had demonstrated that federal law enforcement could effectively address police corruption when local systems failed. Civil rights organizations used the case as a model for how federal prosecutors could use racketeering statutes to dismantle corrupt police units. Law enforcement agencies began reviewing their own oversight procedures to ensure they wouldn't face similar federal intervention. At police academies across the country, the Unit 47 case became required study material for new recruits. Instructors used Torres's and Martinez's downfall to demonstrate that corrupt cops would eventually face consequences for their crimes. But the most significant impact was felt in the community where Unit 47 had operated. For the first time in years, residents reported feeling safe, calling police when they needed help. Children who had been taught to fear officers in uniform began to see them as protectors rather than threats. Officer Kevin Walsh, who had testified against his former colleagues, was reassigned to community policing duties, where he could help rebuild trust between police and residents. His father, retired Sergeant Patrick Walsh, attended his son's first community meeting in his new role. My son learned that good cops protect people from criminals, even when those criminals wear badges, Patrick Walsh told the gathering. Today's federal indictments prove that lesson was correct. As the sun set on the day that federal indictments were announced, David Richardson sat in his backyard with Maya, watching her play with Mr. Snowball, while federal agents finished their evidence collection at neighboring properties. Agent Sarah Chen approached David as he supervised Maya's play. Mr. Richardson, the federal case is solid. Torres and Martinez will likely plead guilty rather than face trial. and the other officers are already negotiating plea agreements. David nodded, understanding that federal prosecution would ensure justice for Unit 47's victims, while sending a message that corrupt cops would face serious consequences. "Agent Chen," David said, "what kind of sentences are we realistically looking at?" "Torres will likely receive 25 to 30 years. Martinez will receive a similar sentence. The other officers will receive sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, depending on their cooperation and level of involvement." David looked at Maya, who was teaching Mr. Snowball how to arrest her toy police cars in a game that involved the teddy bear protecting citizens from bad police. "Agent Chen," David said, "I want to make sure that every family harmed by Unit 47 has the opportunity to address the court during sentencing. Their voices need to be heard, and the officers need to understand the full impact of their crimes." Agent Chen nodded, understanding that victim impact statements would be crucial to ensuring that federal sentences reflected the true scope of Unit 47's damage to the community. "Mr. Richardson, federal prosecutors are planning to call dozens of victims to testify during sentencing. Torres and Martinez will hear from every family they harmed before they're sent to federal prison." As darkness fell over Maple Street, neighbors gathered in David's backyard to celebrate the federal indictments and plan for the long-term reforms that would prevent another Unit 47 from terrorizing their community. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who had organized the neighborhood response to the midnight raid, raised a glass of lemonade to toast the federal prosecutors who had held corrupt cops accountable. "To David Richardson," she announced, "who showed us that one person with courage and federal authority can change an entire system." The gathering on Maple Street wasn't just a celebration of federal indictments. It was the beginning of a community that had learned to demand accountability from their police department and would never again tolerate corruption that was disguised as law enforcement. Federal indictments had been secured, but the real work of reform and healing was just beginning. Unit 47's reckoning would continue in federal court, but the community's reckoning with police corruption would last much longer and ensure that justice was more than just a legal concept. It was a lived reality for everyone who deserved protection under the law. 6 months after the midnight raid on Maple Street, David Richardson stood at the podium in Federal Courtroom 3A, preparing to deliver his victim impact statement before Torres and Martinez received their final sentences. The same courtroom where he'd prosecuted federal crimes for 15 years would now hear how he'd become a victim of the corruption he'd spent his career fighting. Behind David sat over 40 other victims of Unit 47's crimes, filling the gallery with faces that represented years of systemic abuse disguised as law enforcement. Teresa Williams held her son Marcus's hand as they waited to hear Torres receive his sentence. James Morrison sat with his wife, finally feeling that the justice system would vindicate his faith in American institutions. Maria Santos wiped tears from her eyes as she thought about her husband Roberto, whose chronic pain from Unit 47's violence had kept him from attending. Judge Patricia Rodriguez had presided over hundreds of federal sentencing hearings, but she understood that Unit 47's case represented something unprecedented, a complete breakdown of local accountability that had required federal intervention to restore constitutional protections for an entire community. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Rodriguez said, "the court will hear your victim impact statement." David looked at Torres and Martinez, sitting at the defendant's table in orange jumpsuits, their hands shackled to their waists. 6 months earlier, these men had broken down his door and terrorized his family. Today, they would learn how many years they would spend in federal prison for their crimes. "Your Honor," David began, "I have spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor, believing that our justice system could hold criminals accountable regardless of their position or power. 6 months ago, I learned what it feels like when criminals with badges target your family." David's voice remained steady as he described the morning when Unit 47 had raided his home, but his words carried the weight of a father who had watched his daughter's sense of safety shatter when police officers became the source of terror rather than protection. "When Sergeant Torres and Detective Martinez broke down my door, they weren't just committing crimes against my family. They were attacking the constitutional principles that separate law enforcement from organized crime. They turned their badges into weapons and their authority into a license for terrorism. Torres stared at the table in front of him, unable to meet David's eyes. The man who had once commanded a tactical unit with absolute authority now faced spending the rest of his life in federal prison for the crimes he'd committed while wearing a police uniform. Martinez shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as David continued his statement. The detective who had bragged about his ability to find probable cause to arrest anybody was now learning that federal prosecutors could find evidence to convict anybody, including corrupt cops who thought their badges made them untouchable. But this case isn't really about what Unit 47 did to my family, David continued. It's about what they did to hundreds of families over nearly a decade, and what the system allowed them to do by prioritizing statistics over constitutional rights. David turned to address the gallery, filled with Unit 47's victims. Teresa Williams called me 2 years ago because her son had been framed by officers who planted drugs in his backpack and then laughed at his tears. James Morrison was arrested for loitering outside his own business. Maria Santos watched her husband get beaten unconscious by officers who claimed he was resisting arrest while he begged them to stop hitting him. The federal courtroom was silent, except for the quiet sobbing of victims who were finally having their experiences acknowledged by the justice system. For years, they'd been told that their complaints were unfounded, that their memories were unreliable, that their injuries were self-inflicted. Today, a federal judge was hearing their truth. These families didn't lose faith in law enforcement, David said, his voice growing stronger. Law enforcement lost faith in the constitutional principles that give police officers their authority. Unit 47 forgot that badges are issued by the people to protect the people, not to exploit them. Judge Rodriguez nodded, understanding that David's statement was addressing not just Unit 47's crimes, but the systematic failures that had enabled those crimes for nearly a decade. After David's statement, Judge Rodriguez called other victims to address the court. Teresa Williams stood slowly, her hands shaking, as she approached the podium where she would finally confront the officers who had destroyed her son's innocence. "Marcus was 17 when you framed him," she said, looking directly at Torres and Martinez. "He cried for hours that night, saying, 'Mama, they put drugs in my bag and nobody believes me.' I almost didn't believe him myself, because who wants to think that police officers would lie about a child?" Teresa's voice grew stronger as she continued, "But my son was telling the truth, and you were the liars. You laughed at a 17-year-old boy who was terrified and confused about why adults with badges were destroying his life for no reason." Torres finally looked up from the table, meeting Teresa's eyes for the first time since the night he'd arrested her son. In her gaze, he saw not anger or hatred, but the disappointment of a mother who had taught her children to respect police officers and had watched those officers betray that respect. "Marcus is in college now," Teresa continued. "He's studying criminal justice because he wants to become the kind of police officer you should have been. He wants to protect families instead of terrorizing them. He wants to serve justice instead of corrupting it." As Teresa returned to her seat, James Morrison approached the podium. The businessman who had been arrested outside his own store carried himself with the dignity of someone who had never lost faith in America's promise of equal justice under law. "I've owned my store for 15 years, Morrison said. "I've employed 12 people from this community, paid my taxes, and supported local charities. But when Unit 47 decided I was suspicious for standing outside my own business, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was the color of my skin." Morrison looked at Torres with the expression of a man who had spent 2 years wondering whether his country still believed in the constitutional protections that were supposed to apply to everyone equally. "You arrested me for loitering outside a business I've owned for 15 years. You charged me with providing false information when I showed you my business license and keys. You made me spend a weekend in jail because you couldn't believe that a black man could own property in a neighborhood you thought belonged to someone else." Morrison's statement wasn't delivered with anger, but with the sad acknowledgement of someone who had learned that constitutional rights were only as strong as the officers who were supposed to protect them. "But I never lost faith in the system," Morrison continued. "I kept my receipts, I saved my documents, and I waited for the day when real law enforcement would hold fake law enforcement accountable. Today is that day. As Morrison returned to his seat, Maria Santos approached the podium with photographs of her husband's injuries from Unit 47's beating. The medical records showed fractures, concussions, and permanent disabilities that had resulted from what Torres's report had called minimal force necessary to subdue a resisting suspect. My husband Roberto couldn't be here today because he still has chronic pain from the beating you gave him, Maria said, holding up photographs that showed Roberto's swollen face and broken ribs. He was fully cooperative during the traffic stop, but you beat him unconscious anyway because he asked why he was being arrested. Maria's voice shook with emotion as she described watching her husband suffer for 2 years with injuries that Unit 47 had claimed were self-inflicted. Roberto works as a janitor at the hospital now, but he can only work part-time because of the pain from his injuries. We lost our health insurance, we couldn't make our mortgage payments, and we had to move to a smaller apartment because of what you did to him. Torres felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Genuine remorse for the harm he'd caused to innocent people. Listening to Maria describe her husband's ongoing suffering, Torres began to understand that his crimes had consequences that extended far beyond arrest statistics and departmental commendations. After all victim impact statements had been heard, Judge Rodriguez addressed Torres and Martinez directly. "Mr. Torres and Mr. Martinez," she began, "you have been convicted of operating a criminal enterprise under the color of police authority. You used your badges to commit crimes against the very citizens you swore to protect. You turned law enforcement into organized crime." The judge's voice carried the weight of federal authority as she continued. "Your crimes were not isolated incidents of poor judgment or excessive force. They were systematic violations of civil rights that terrorized an entire community for nearly a decade." Judge Rodriguez looked at the gallery filled with victims, understanding that her sentences would determine whether Unit 47's victims believed that justice was still possible in America. "Mr. Torres, you led a criminal conspiracy that violated the constitutional rights of hundreds of citizens. You accepted bribes from drug dealers, planted evidence during arrests, and covered up crimes committed by officers under your command. Most significantly, you created a culture where constitutional violations were normalized and accountability was eliminated." Torres stood as Judge Rodriguez prepared to announce his sentence, understanding that his crimes had finally caught up with him in a way that local accountability had never achieved. "Mr. Torres, I sentence you to 30 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. You will serve this sentence in a maximum security federal facility, and you will be supervised by federal probation for the remainder of your life upon release." The sentence was longer than Torres had expected, but Judge Rodriguez wasn't finished. "Mr. Martinez, you were the enforcer for this criminal enterprise. You committed acts of violence against citizens who posed no threat to public safety. You tortured suspects during arrests, destroyed evidence of your crimes, and threatened witnesses who tried to report your misconduct." Martinez stood on shaking legs, understanding that his life as a free man was about to end for crimes he'd committed while wearing a police uniform. "Mr. Martinez, I sentence you to 32 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Your sentence is longer than Mr. Torres's because your personal violence exceeded even the violence inherent in the conspiracy you joined." As federal marshals led Torres and Martinez out of the courtroom in shackles, Unit 47's victims felt something many had thought they'd never experience: the satisfaction of seeing corrupt cops face real consequences for their crimes. But the sentencing hearing wasn't the end of Unit 47's reckoning. Judge Rodriguez also announced the appointment of a federal monitor who would oversee police department reforms for the next 5 years, ensuring that another corrupt unit could never operate with the impunity that Unit 47 had enjoyed. Outside the courthouse, community leaders held a press conference to address the long-term reforms that would prevent future corruption. Interim Police Chief Jennifer Walsh announced the completion of comprehensive retraining for every officer in the department, with new emphasis on constitutional rights, de-escalation techniques, and community accountability. "Every officer in this department has been retrained from the ground up," Chief Walsh announced. We've eliminated the quota systems that incentivized unconstitutional arrests. We've installed independent oversight that can't be corrupted by internal politics. And we've created accountability mechanisms that will prevent another Unit 47 from terrorizing our community. The new Oversight Board included federal monitors, civil rights lawyers, and community members who had been victimized by police misconduct. Unlike the old internal affairs system, this board had real authority to investigate complaints, discipline officers, and refer cases to federal prosecutors when necessary. Officer Kevin Walsh, who had testified against his former colleagues, was promoted to sergeant and placed in charge of the new Community Policing Division. His first assignment was to rebuild trust between police and the neighborhoods that Unit 47 had terrorized for years. My father taught me that police officers are supposed to protect people from criminals. Sergeant Walsh told a gathering of community leaders. Unit 47 forgot that lesson, but this department won't make that mistake again. The federal conviction of Unit 47 had created ripple effects throughout law enforcement agencies across the country. Police departments began reviewing their oversight procedures, afraid that they might face similar federal intervention if corruption was discovered in their ranks. The Justice Department used Unit 47's case as a model for how federal prosecutors could use racketeering statutes to dismantle corrupt police units. Civil rights organizations cited the case as proof that federal oversight could effectively address police misconduct when local accountability failed. But the most significant impact was felt in the community where Unit 47 had operated. For the first time in years, residents felt safe calling police when they needed help. Children who had been taught to fear officers in uniform began to see them as protectors rather than threats. 1 year after the midnight raid on Maple Street, David Richardson stood in his backyard with Maya, watching her play with neighborhood children who no longer scattered when police cars drove down their street. The broken front door had been replaced with a stronger one, but the real security came from knowing that corrupt cops were in federal prison and honest cops were rebuilding community trust. "Daddy," Maya said as she took a break from playing, "do you remember when the bad police broke our door?" David looked at his daughter, now 7 years old, who had processed her trauma with the help of federal victim services and the support of a community that had rallied around her family. "I remember, baby. But I also remember that the good police put the bad police in jail. And now families like ours are safe." Maya nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that would define her understanding of justice for the rest of her life. "Daddy, why didn't the bad police just choose to be good police instead?" David knelt down to meet Maya's eyes, understanding that his answer would shape how she viewed law enforcement, government authority, and individual responsibility. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people forget that wearing a uniform doesn't make them better than other people. It just gives them the responsibility to help people when they need it most. The bad police forgot that lesson, so the good police had to remind them by putting them in jail." Maya considered this explanation, then asked, "Will there be bad police again?" David looked around at the neighborhood where children were playing safely, where residents called police when they needed help, and where federal oversight ensured that constitutional rights were protected rather than violated. "There might be, baby. But now we know that when police officers break the law, they go to jail just like everyone else. And there are good police officers who will make sure that families like ours are always protected." As the sun set over Maple Street, neighbors gathered for their monthly community meeting with local police officers. These meetings, which had been established as part of the federal reform agreement, gave residents direct access to police leadership and ensured that community concerns were addressed before they could escalate into federal cases. Sergeant Kevin Walsh addressed the gathering, flanked by officers who understood that their authority came from community trust rather than tactical intimidation. 6 months ago, this community was terrorized by officers who forgot that police work is about service, not power, Walsh said. "Today we're building a police department that earns your trust every day through constitutional policing and community accountability." Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, now 79 years old, raised her hand to ask a question that reflected the community's ongoing vigilance. "Sergeant Walsh, How can we be sure that another Unit 47 won't develop in 5 years when federal oversight ends? Walsh looked at the elderly woman who had organized the neighborhood response to Unit 47's midnight raid, understanding that her question reflected the community's determination to never again tolerate police corruption. Mrs. Patterson, the federal reforms we've implemented aren't temporary fixes. They're permanent changes to how this department operates. We have independent oversight that can't be corrupted, training that emphasizes constitutional rights, and accountability mechanisms that make it impossible for corrupt officers to operate with impunity. Walsh paused, then added the most important element of the new system. But most importantly, we have a community that knows its rights and isn't afraid to demand accountability. You've proven that federal oversight works when local systems fail. That knowledge will protect you better than any policy or procedure. As the community meeting ended, residents didn't immediately disperse. They lingered in small groups, sharing updates about their lives, organizing neighborhood activities, and maintaining the social connections that had been strengthened by their shared struggle against Unit 47's corruption. David Richardson stood with Maya on his shoulders, watching neighbors who had been brought together by police misconduct, but were now united by shared commitment to justice and accountability. Agent Sarah Chen, who had led the federal investigation of Unit 47, approached David as the crowd began to thin. "Mr. Richardson," she said, "I wanted you to know that the Unit 47 case has become a model for how federal law enforcement addresses police corruption. Your investigation and the community's response have created precedents that will protect citizens across the country." David looked at Agent Chen, understanding that Unit 47's downfall had implications that extended far beyond their local community. "Agent Chen, what's the most important lesson from this case?" "That accountability works when it's enforced," she replied. "Local systems failed to hold Unit 47 accountable, so federal systems stepped in. The officers learned that badges don't provide immunity from justice, and the community learned that their constitutional rights are protected by federal law enforcement when local protection fails." As Agent Chen walked away, David felt Maya tugging on his collar. "Daddy, can we go inside? I want to show Mr. Snowball my homework." David smiled, understanding that his daughter's request represented the most important victory of the entire federal case. A child who felt safe in her own home, who trusted that the system would protect her, and who was growing up in a community where justice was more than just a legal concept. Inside their house, Maya spread her homework on the kitchen table while David prepared dinner. Her assignment was to write about someone who had helped their community, and she'd chosen to write about the federal agents who had arrested the bad police. "Daddy," Maya said as she worked on her assignment, "Agent Chen helped our family, didn't she?" "Yes, baby. Agent Chen and all the federal agents helped make sure that bad police couldn't hurt families anymore." Maya nodded and continued writing, her 7-year-old handwriting carefully forming words that would define her understanding of justice. "The FBI agents helped my daddy catch the bad police who broke our door. Now the bad police are in jail, and good police protect families like mine. I want to be an FBI agent when I grow up, so I can help families too." David read over Maya's shoulder, understanding that Unit 47's midnight raid had accidentally created the next generation's commitment to federal law enforcement and constitutional protection. As darkness fell over Maple Street, the neighborhood that had been terrorized by corrupt cops was now protected by honest officers, federal oversight, and a community that would never again tolerate the abuse of police authority. Unit 47's legacy wasn't the corruption they'd spread or the families they'd harmed. It was the reform they'd inadvertently triggered when they raided the wrong house and found federal justice waiting for them. The new foundation for law enforcement in their community was built on constitutional principles, federal accountability, and the understanding that badges represent service to the people rather than power over them. And in a house on Maple Street, a 7-year-old girl was learning that justice wasn't just possible. It was inevitable when good people refused to accept corruption as normal and demanded accountability from those who served them.